Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We're delighted that you could join us for this conversation today. My name is Alba Topoli. I'm the CEO of Power for All. Power for All, we're a global campaign and innovation hub focused on accelerating the adoption of decentralized renewables and integrated energy solutions to end energy poverty faster. And very much aligned with that mission, what we will be looking today is at a shift in the geography of Africa's energy access gap, and one that bears implications for how we plan, invest in, and ultimately deliver electricity. But before we get started, I wanted to share a very quick story just outside of Uganda's capital city of Kampala in a town called Chiwumu. In Chiwumu, power lines ran in plain sight of homes and shops because Chiwumu sat just 3 kilometers from the national grid. Yet the community stayed in the dark for a decade after repeated promises that the grid would arrive. Often in our sector, this is the kind of story that we hear that it must be because Chiwumu was remote or hard to reach. And actually, Chiwumu is neither. Across Africa, as the grid stretches to reach more customers, utilities are fulfilling their mandate, but often also deepening commercial losses in the process. As each new wave of grid extension reaches poorer, lower consuming households with often few appliances and limited purchasing power. And it's really that tension between fulfilling an essential public service that is critical for social equity while ensuring commercial viability that defines the very dilemma that utilities face. But that's also, as we'll see today, not the whole story. Rapid urbanization is transforming communities just like Chiwumu. They're no longer isolated villages, but rather growing centers of household and business demand, just not yet at the scale or form that utilities can serve profitably. So to end Chiwumu's long wait for electricity, and that we did, we had to rethink business as usual. So when Chiwumu was finally connected, it wasn't through traditional grid extension methods. It actually happened through a new early grid demand creation model that Power for All and our partners pioneered that's called Utilities 2.0. And there, what we did was to combine a mini grid with demand side investments, so efficient appliances and small business equipment, but all worked under one shared goal. And that was to build demand to the level that the utility needed to then make grid extension viable. And it worked. Within a year, over 90% of the town was electrified, demand grew 30 times, new businesses opened, and business revenues for those businesses that accessed appliances and business equipment rose nearly 70%. And just 18 months later, the utility interconnected with a mini-grid, and that mini-grid was then redeployed to power up another underserved site. So today, Chiwumu's customers form a sustainable base for utility operations. And it's not just an isolated story. Across rapidly urbanizing Africa, towns like Chiwumu are multiplying along these expanding urban corridors. The challenge now isn't just reaching them. It's fundamentally rethinking how utilities, distributed energy providers, the appliance sector, and governments can collaborate to do so efficiently and sustainably. And it's the very crux of the research that we'll discuss today. It helps us to finally start going beyond the rural-urban binary and map where the unelectrified are across the continuum of urban to rural. We'll actually also see where Chiwumu exactly falls in that continuum, and also begin to unpack what that means for designing solutions that can reach these growing populations in plain sight of the grid, but waiting just beyond the line. We're thrilled today to co-host this session with our colleagues at the Ralph O'Connor Sustainable Energy Institute and Renew at Johns Hopkins University. And it is my pleasure to now hand off to Daniel Kamen, Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of the Just Energy Transition at the Johns Hopkins University, to share with us his opening remarks. And Dan is currently in flight and couldn't join in person, but he has shared video remarks that we will now play.
Hello, and welcome to the webinar on aligning energy solutions with Africa's urbanizing spatial realities. I'm Dan Kamen, the Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Energy and Climate Justice at Johns Hopkins University in the departments of Civil and Systems Engineering, and also in the School of Advanced International Affairs, where I play a role in something called ROSEI, the Ralph O'Connor Sustainable Energy Institute, that spans all of campus and is our host today. I'd like to thank you all for attending, and in particular, I am looking forward to your comments, your input, and hopefully your continued collaboration as we build a joint paper and a database and a resource that can involve everyone on this call who is genuinely committed and able to bring data, technology, and social solutions to bear to closing Africa's electricity gap. As you'll hear in the initial comments from Doctors Jess Kersey and Sam Miles, Jess is at SMAP at the World Bank, and Sam is a postdoctoral fellow with me at Johns Hopkins in ROSEI, and then also across the units I've mentioned, Civil and Systems Engineering, and also the School of Advanced International Studies. What Sam and Jess have done in their dissertation research and now in their current positions is, I think, lay the founding work with a number of colleagues around how we can think, hopefully more creatively and more rapidly, to bring ideas to the practical world of how to think about the issues of energy access, where it is not just a question of hardware to reach the perhaps 650 million people without electricity, many of whom are thought to be in far-flung rural areas, and there is a significant population that fits that bill, but also in the peri-urban and in the urban areas, often clustered around industrial and other opportunities where the energy access resources are poor. So what I'm hoping we will get from today's discussion is an examination of those factors, to look for not only where technology can play an enhanced role, such as through mini-grids or what are often called metro grids that connect with and interact with the grid, but also in the opportunities to think about software, firmware, and in particular behavioral solutions, market innovations that allow us to think most cost effectively about how to bridge the energy access gap. Again, this is not just about failures on the part of utilities or failures on the part of NGOs to support communities, although we can find examples of both of those. It's really a time when we need to look closely at the aspects of the technology to policy interface, and also the ways in which environmental justice or lack of environmental justice and lack of thinking about the benefits to everyone of investing in clean, secure, reliable energy solutions can open the door to a whole range of new opportunities to both build hardware solutions, but also build community support and trust so that we can find ways to make the energy access goal for 2030, which I shouldn't need to remind any of us, is one of 100% affordable and reliable electricity access, where these 650 million people, the majority of whom are in Africa, are not being served by our current institutions, whether they're parastatal, state-based, or informal. So I'm hoping this opportunity, this workshop, will build a platform of a research to action agenda. I welcome you all to take part. I also welcome you all to visit us at ROSEI at Johns Hopkins when you're in Washington, D.C., or our field efforts in Goma in the DRC and in Kenya. Thank you all for joining. Asante sana na karibuni.
Thank you, Dan, for those remarks and also for anchoring us in justice that will certainly carry us throughout the session. I will shortly hand it off to Jess and Sam, and thank you also for those introductions. But before I do so, I wanted to also introduce our panel. We're delighted today to be joined by Dr. Bello Salman, Technical Advisor to the MD CEO at the Rural Electrification Agency in Nigeria, Ayman Wadeen, Director of Research, Data and Standards at the Africa Mini Grid Developers Association, Bishal Thapa, Chief Strategy and Impact Officer at CLASP, and Brian Kelly, Founder and CEO at the Anzana Electric Group. And the panel will be moderated by my colleague Sumaya Mohammed, our Utilities Innovation and Uganda Country Director. I want to just note that as we go through the session, please feel free to share your questions via the Q&A function. And after the webinar, we will share the slides, the research, as well as the webinar recording. And with that, I now turn it over to Dr. Jessica Kersey and Dr. Sam Miles.
Hi there. Good morning from DC. It's really a pleasure for me to be with you here today and to present a piece of research that has been at this point 5 or 6 years in the making. Very exciting to see it now kind of presented to such a diverse audience working in the SDG 7 field. So when I started my grad studies at UC Berkeley, I was really interested in exploring this topic of rural electrification. But as I started to learn about this megatrend that is global urbanization, I started more and more to really question this narrative of rural versus urban. So this talk will present kind of novel empirical evidence that really seeks to understand spatially how the unelectrified are distributed across the continent. And really put simply, it's where do the unelectrified live? Later in the presentation, I'll pass to my colleague and co-author Sam, who will present some new research on how the existing suite of energy solutions kind of are serving these diverse spaces. So what do we know about electricity access? These are the top line numbers from the custodian agencies that are kind of responsible for collecting and reporting information on progress towards Sustainable Development Goal 7. Folks will be familiar with these numbers. We know that somewhere around north of 700 million people globally don't have access to electricity. We know that the vast majority of these people live in sub-Saharan Africa, with the share of energy poverty kind of increasingly concentrated in this region. So for operational purposes, of course, we need to disaggregate this data, right? And in energy access, one way that we tend to do this is by this rural-urban binary. So what the statistics tell us is that 80% of the unelectrified in sub-Saharan Africa are rural. And what this has done is really built a lot of weight around the idea of rural electrification. So kind of that the imperative of universal energy access is rural electrification. Next slide. And the challenge that this poses is that in reality, it's a very poor way to capture the reality of kind of sustained and large scale urbanization across the world and across sub-Saharan Africa in particular. So the title of this slide is a quote from the Cities Alliance Director, who I think sums it up quite nicely. He says that the global population is urbanizing, it's Africanizing, and it's informalizing. So African urbanization is incredibly complex. I would bring to your attention 3 key trends that I tend to kind of study in relation to energy access. One is a phenomenon called in situ densification. So this is where a formerly rural area will densify over time. It will grow into a small town. That town will eventually grow into a city that over time gets larger and larger and larger. The second trend is urban sprawl. So that's what you can see in this image here. This is when cities are spreading well beyond their kind of official administrative boundaries, often then merging with other cities in kind of larger constellations of urban life that we call conurbations. And then as a last trend, I'd bring your attention to the prevalence of informal forms of settlement across all of these different geographies. Next slide. Now the question is kind of why do we care about the intersection of electricity and urbanization? Now, electricity, of course, has a critical role in urbanization. It underpins nearly every dimension of a healthy urban life. So we think about things like health services, education, mobility, e-governance, all of these types of things. And infrastructure planning really must adapt to keep pace with these evolving human settlement patterns. And the question kind of is, urbanization can either be an engine of economic growth, or what we're going to end up with is kind of urbanization that just deepens and kind of further entrenches these economic and spatial exclusions that we already are seeing. Next slide. So moving into the research, I want to kind of give credit to the collaborators that worked on this. So Sam and I but also an organization called Atlas AI that provided the kind of underlying geospatial data and analytical support. The International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, IASA, and also colleagues at the World Bank. So what this work aims to do at the highest level is to evaluate the distribution of the unelectrified population across 43 countries in sub-Saharan Africa using two spatial frameworks. The first is not pictured here. It's kind of a geospatial framework that stands as a proxy for this rural-urban binary that we're used to using. And the second is what you see here, and it's called the Urban Rural Catchment Area, URCA for short. So we're going to spend a little bit of time with the URCA framework because it's really important to be able to understand this framework to interpret the results that are going to come next. And at the very highest level, you can think about it as kind of one being this most urban category, and then moving across the spectrum towards the most remote in category URCA 30. But within these 30 categories, there's different groups. So we see highlighted here, group 1 through 7. So these are people that are actually within an urban core, and each different category depends on the population size of the city of reference. So Sarah, if you can go to the next slide. We have 8 through 14 that represent people that live within an hour of cities of these kind of 7 urban hierarchies. And then moving forward, we've got 15 through 28. So these are 2 groups, folks 1 to 2 hours from a city, and then folks 2 to 3 hours from a city. And then the last group is kind of this most remote categories of 29 and 30. And these are people that are more than 3 hours from any city of reference. 2 more notes on the methodology here. The travel time is based on a least cost path calculation over what's called a global friction surface. Basically, what this does is it estimates the amount of time needed to cover a grid cell. It takes into account things like transport modes, roads, land cover, international crossings, et cetera. And then 2 limitations to note. The electrification data set that we use likely doesn't take into account electrification via solar home systems and solar lighting products that kind of aren't detectable through satellite imagery. And then conversely, urban energy poverty, I suspect, is also very kind of underestimated because of what we call the halo effect of kind of bright street and other types of urban lighting. So now we can go to next. So this graph shows the top line result. It's the distribution of unelectrified versus electrified people across the urban framework. So the question is, what can we identify from this distribution? So next. First takeaway, only 8% of the unelectrified fall into this most remote, kind of most dispersed category. And we can already start to understand that this is in really stark contrast to a narrative that places 80% of the unelectrified in kind of this fuzzy category for rural areas. If this was the case, what we'd expect to see, I think, is a lot more people in these most remote categories. Next. Instead, what we're finding is that 63% of the unelectrified, which equates to something like 340 million people, live in a city or within an hour's travel time to a city, and especially cities of a kind of medium-sized category. So I'd call your attention, for example, to URCA category 12. Now, this represents places that are less than 1 hour to a city of 100 to 250,000. And this category has the single largest share of unelectrified of any of the URCA categories. Okay, next. Let's see. And then there's about a third of these unelectrified that live in what I would call the kind of extended urban periphery. They're not exactly urban adjacent, but they're also not extremely remote. And another thing to keep in mind with these categories is that these are also places of transition. Many of these places are likely even depopulating as folks are kind of picking up and moving to seek opportunities in cities. Okay, next. Moving into a couple of additional results. This graph shows what's called a hotspot analysis. So what it represents is for each of the 5,000 urban agglomerations in our data set, it shows the population of unelectrified and the overall electrification rate within a 20-kilometer radius of that urban point of reference. Now, what we need to remember here is that urbanization is not, I think this is a very common misconception. Urbanization is not just kind of one primary city that's getting larger and larger and larger. Urbanization is really taking place across a spectrum of emerging secondary and tertiary cities. So what we can find from this graph is, one, we can see a few regions of interest. We see in these call out boxes, the Ethiopian highlands, the Gulf of Guinea, and then an area where Sam and I have done a lot of our field work, the African Great Lakes region. And for me, this way of looking at the data, what it really accomplishes is to highlight just the enormous number of cities across the continent that are still facing pretty stark access deficits. Next slide. As a final result, let's look at some results in terms that folks are likely a little bit more familiar with. And so leaving behind the IRCA category, now this graph is representing space in terms of actual physical distance kilometers. So what does this tell us? Essentially, electrification is weaker in the peripheries of secondary and tertiary cities. And as you move in terms of kilometers, of course, from the city core, the drop off in electrification rate is much more drastic as the city size decreases. So for example, whereas people 10 kilometers from a city of 1 to 5 million inhabitants are almost fully electrified, for people within 10 kilometers of a city of 50 to 100,000, the electrification rate is just over 50%. And this work really underscores a lot of other work that has been coming out of kind of urban studies, urban demographics field that has been calling attention for the need for more infrastructure investment to support healthy urban growth in these secondary and tertiary cities. Next slide. So quick recap, and I'll pass off to Sam. So these results, they really question the idea that the unelectrified live in these super remote, isolated, hard to reach places, or really that energy poverty is something that we can so readily equate with rural poverty. Instead, we find the majority of the unelectrified in sub-Saharan Africa live in places that I would describe as kind of urban proximate, or urbanizing. So we saw 63% of folks live either within a city or within an hour of an urban center. And only a minority of these folks live in these very remote communities that have until now really been a driver of Africa's electrification push. So what this research until now tells us is demographics, right? It tells us where the electrification or energy access deficits lay. Where are the people without access? Going back to my kind of initial question. What it doesn't do is connect kind of this spatial reality to the types of solutions that we need to serve these people. So Sam and I were really excited to take this opportunity to bring in some field experience, and kind of Sam's section of the presentation, we'll start to think about how we might match these really diverse geographies of energy and access that we're seeing to the policy and technical solutions needed. So over to you, Sam.
Thanks very much, Jess. And we can go to the next slide, please. And as Jess mentioned, here we'll be shifting from mapping where the unelectrified are to asking which technologies actually fit which kinds of places. And what we're seeing here on the screen here, again, is this distribution of electrified versus unelectrified across the 30 categories of remoteness. And what we've added at the top here is an illustrative mapping of different energy solutions that might be appropriate across the IRCA framework, featuring some of the terms that have begun to emerge for technologies that don't seem to fall neatly across the traditional categories of grid extension, mini grids, and standalone systems, much in the way that our geospatial analysis aims to complicate the rural-urban binary. And we're going to keep our focus here just on the grid segment and try to get towards a more nuanced typology of grids that matches the spatial realities of where, as we've seen, energy poverty is actually concentrated. And the challenge being to recognize the distinct barriers and opportunities that are occurring at different levels of remoteness, but also be cognizant of the fuzziness of these boundaries, as well as the overlap and the potential for new use cases and business models to arise in these emerging spaces. Next slide, please. So one place to start is to look at where mini-grids are and have been deployed. And here we're showing data from the Bloomberg New Energy Finance mini-grid database. And when we filter down to the approximately 180 grids in Africa from that data set for which there's GPS data to do the IRCA matching, we immediately see a concentration of grids deployed in these most remote spaces. But we're not going to dwell too long on this snapshot because the results are actually heavily driven by data availability from certain project portfolios and countries, and limited by data quality. But that being said, we think it does a good job in highlighting, though, through that big jump that you see in the IRCA 30 category there on the right, a potentially large discrepancy between where mini-grids have historically been deployed and where the unelectrified increasingly are, as we saw in Jess's overview. Next slide, please. So to get a bit more nuance into this issue, over the past several years of our doctorates, Jess and I have been visiting sites ourselves to understand how the models and technologies are evolving. And while this sample of 18 mini-grids mapped across the IRCA framework that you see here is also by no means comprehensive or representative of the entire continent's mini-grids either, it does immediately demonstrate that many of today's sites are increasingly urban, urban adjacent, and urbanizing. So this is a mapping of, as I mentioned, 18 mini-grids that we visited over the past 4 years in 4 countries where we took photos, interviewed operators, customers, developers, and deployed a standardized techno-economic survey. And they're mapped here to their IRCA category, color-coded by country, bubble size indicating system size, and number of connections on the y-axis. And so for the next few minutes, we'll walk through a couple trends we've observed from our fieldwork that can hopefully motivate a more grounded discussion of what technologies and systems are appropriate for the spatial realities of the communities that they serve. So next slide, please. So starting from the most remote categories, where what we've historically thought of as rural mini-grids, we've been struck by the modularity and containerization that has proliferated across deployments to solve the right sizing challenge of not overbuilding, not underbuilding, but installing just the right size system that can grow with anticipated demand. Next slide, please. Whereas in the peri-urban segment, what has stuck out has been experiments in providing grid edge value addition services to the macro grid or utility. Next slide. And lastly, the emergence of so-called metro grids for large underserved urban populations. And we'll go through a quick overview of some of these in the next few slides, just to sort of, again, start to unpack and motivate the need for more spatially informed typology of different distinct grids. Next slide, please. So starting with the most remote, maybe what we're most familiar with historically, one of the key challenges here, as I mentioned, has been properly sizing the system to community demand. And over the years, there's been this trend towards modularity, standardization, and containerization. So what we see here is a 20 kilowatt winch system in northern Uganda. And what's interesting, I think, is the spread that we see this trend working at, whether it's at the small 3 kilowatt scale through a 6 by 6 by 6 foot miniaturized container for remote health clinics and productive uses, all the way up to the 100, 200 kilowatt scale for large yet remote agglomerations. And what we're noticing through this has been that though this drives down deployment costs, the main challenge for developers operating in remote segments still remains in securing good sites that are connected to markets despite being remote. And this is a real challenge because it's the difference between a growing urbanizing village or site versus one that's actually depopulating because of urbanization. So we see immediately how important urbanization trends are even in these remote sites. And that kind of speaks to the challenge that some developers have, to my understanding, which actually is no longer operational, in part because of these challenging dynamics in negotiating urbanization trends. So next slide, please. And so where are kind of folks going when you experience this depopulation or this urbanization phenomenon? Often directly not to the capital, but to their periphery or to the periphery of the nearest secondary or tertiary city. So here what we see is the Utilities 2.0 project led by Power for All in partnership with Ugandan utility Umeme in Chibumu, Uganda, about 40 minutes outside of Kampala. And that's what Alba mentioned in the opening talk. And there's lots of exciting learnings coming out of this model that we can follow up with. But what's critical is the Utilities 2.0 model shows how private developers can bridge grid proximate communities connecting customers years before formal extension. And what we're seeing in this model is developers specializing in rapid connections for households and businesses paired with demand stimulation, building up a customer portfolio for when the grid is actually ready to extend, giving them almost like a turnkey new but mature customer base, rather than, as in the case for many utilities, the business proposition of losing money on every additional newly electrified grid connection. So next slide, please. And lastly, a phenomenon where there are still large urban pockets of energy poverty, which maybe don't kind of square neatly with the conversations we have when we think about rural electrification. A prominent example of this is Nuru, the metro grid in Goma, DRC, where I did much of my doctoral fieldwork. And to my knowledge, this remains the largest renewable energy grid serving household customers in Africa, initially at 1.3 megawatts, now interconnected to almost more than 5 megawatts. with some fascinating arrangements with the other private grid companies serving Goma, a unique regulatory sandbox situation where the regulator demarcates which parts of the city can be served by which power providers, but also how interconnection and off-taker agreements can be structured between them to maximize energy access in this large city with well over 1 million people, rapidly growing communities at its peripheries, and some really challenging and complex geopolitical and humanitarian dynamics happening in the background. So we like this example because it really engenders the unique technical, social, and financial challenges of distinct grid providers that, as we've mentioned, they don't neatly fall into our traditional power categories, as this is sort of doing rural electrification type things, but through a public infrastructure process. Next slide, please. So what we've tried to do here in this and the previous few slides is actually capture some of these important distinctions across these segments that motivate taking a harder look at existing market size estimations for different grids and grid technologies, and looking more closely at the challenges and solutions unique to each segment. So one clear commonality across the 3 cases we've examined is the need to develop finance instruments that balance debt, equity, and concessional finance on terms appropriate for diverging business models. So metro grids, for example, we've realized that we've been told they could very much benefit from guarantee instruments that are actually more commonplace for large and utility scale infrastructure projects, more so than rural electrification. Another one, of course, is the regulatory challenges. Are the rules for electrifying remote communities appropriate for developers seeking to provide utilities value addition services at the grid edge and for those providing large-scale public infrastructure? And so returning to this initial question, how do rural-urban designations that change not only over time, but differ country by country, clarify or muddy the waters in parsing through these questions at the continent scale? And so this analysis is a bit of a beginning effort we hope to take forward from these discussions with this audience in terms of a framework, a typology framework that provides insights into better targeting of sites for different players, more appropriate financing models that address the spatial and demographic specificities, and ultimately more technically accurate definitions and narratives about electrification challenges and solutions. Next slide, please. So this is a starting point in an effort to reframe how we understand and respond to this challenge. And so we invite you to explore the research through the QR codes on the screen, and it'll also be shared with the webinar materials. So just to conclude before we transition to the panel discussion, again, we've traced over the last couple minutes how the geography of the unelectrified is shifting, increasingly towards urban and urban proximate areas, even as many of our approaches and assumptions still lean rural. What this analysis suggests is that these lines, these urban, peri-urban, and remote demarcations, they're not fixed, they're evolving. And our finance, regulation, technology, and business models, they need to evolve with them. So just a starting point in an effort to reframe how we understand and respond to this. So with that, thank you for your attention, and I'll hand it back over to Samaya, who will lead us through a panel discussion on how to explore these shifts, how they're playing out in practice, and what they mean for the next phase of electrification. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sam Miles and Jessica. At this stage, I'd like to invite all of my panelists to please switch on their videos and join me in this panel discussion, please. Excellent. So, Jess and Sam, I think we'll kick, this discussion off. Those research insights were, quite profound. But I think just to help us to, further appreciate, this analysis is how can this analysis inform market estimations for DRE deployment across the different urban and peri-urban contexts? And I'll allow either of you, to answer that.
Yeah, I'll take this one. So one element of this that we didn't really have time to touch on in the presentation here, but that is in the paper itself, is the question of the models that we use to do market estimation. So most of these are based on least cost geospatial. Like I think a lot of folks will be familiar with the onset model, for example, and they rely on proxy estimations for demand. demand is like notoriously difficult to estimate, but really important in determining modeling outputs. But one issue is that many models still continue to estimate demand versus based on rural or urban status. So two more points here. One is that many of the models also assume spatial exclusivity. So they'll, for example, they'll draw a geographic boundary around existing grid infrastructure and just reserve that for grid extension. They also, in that same vein, they don't allow multiple technologies to kind of coexist in the same space, even if in reality they might be kind of supportive of each other. And then a third point here is that many of the models are very rigid about the technologies that they can model. Most that I've seen are either grid, mini grid, or solar home system. And for me, this by definition kind of excludes some of these more innovative technologies that we're seeing now. One that I really like, I've been very interested in following, is Solar's mesh grid, which we've seen be successful in very remote types of contexts, and we've also seen in urban contexts. So I think going back to the original question of market sizing, there's a lot of ways that we need to operationalize some of this thinking, even just in our models, to understand kind of the spectrum of technologies that are emerging, the spectrum of kind of geographies that are in need, and how we kind of match these a little bit more fluidly and naturally.
Thank you so much, Jason. I think that is so important. I see a few colleagues, from other research institutions. So hopefully there's a few more PhD students that has gotten a nudge. Ayman, I'd like to turn to you, and you're representing, EMDA today. How is EMDA interpreting the research findings, and how are these emerging trends reflected in the planned pipelines and investments of your developers?
Thank you, Sumaya, for that question, and thank you, Jess and Sam, for that presentation. So yeah, when it comes to the findings, there's a lot of what we are seeing happening with our members. An example will be DRC, where even some of the information given by our members at Nuru. So we know that DRC actually population, like less than 20% of the population have access to energy. So Nuru actually coming up with a technology of the metro grid to integrate cutting edge technology to service and design 24 hours reliable energy. So in 2023, actually, they were able to close $40 million in equity funds. And this fund actually will enable them to start commencing of a construction of a 13.7 megawatt project, which was significantly to expand its operation assets in the eastern DRC, that is in Goma, Kindu, and Bunia. So this, of course, we are seeing will help bridge the enormous energy gap within those city areas. Another technology that I need to mention also that is coming through the members is what we call the interconnected mini-grids. I'll give an example mainly within Nigeria. So one of our members, PowerGen, actually have 4 operational inter-mini-grid sites that add 3 megawatts of solar PV capacity and 3 megawatts of battery storage. This has enabled expand existing distribution network now that serves approximately 6,300 connections within the urban and peri-urban areas. So this pioneering project offers critical insights to accelerating future inter-mini-grid development, making them more faster, more cost-effective, and scalable. And actually within the Nigeria, we are aware of the DARES program, which is supported by the World Bank, which mentioned that they aim to support close to 125 inter-mini grids with the amount of 127 million in grant funding over the next 3 years. At the same time, also the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission has mandated the DISCOs to procure 10% of the annual energy supply from this. So finally, in terms of how this will happen, there's a report by RMI, Rocky Mountain Institution, that states that with recent analysis show an estimated opportunity of up to 22 gigawatts. That's around 4,000 to 8,000 single project, depending on their size. That is almost twice the existing installed generation capacity in that country. So the market opportunity could result to electrifying almost 125 million, which is also critical in achieving the SDG goal.
Thanks.
And the Vision 300.
Thank you so much, Ayman. And with that, I'd like to, invite Dr. Salman. And I'm glad that Ayman has touched on, Nigeria is really kind of leading in terms of interconnected mini grids. But from a service territory perspective, how does ROSEI's mandate align, with these findings, and how can it be expanded to support more integrated approaches beyond, remote rural areas?
Thank you very much, Sumaya, and the rest of the team. I would like to start by commending the authors. This is actually a really insightful and rigorous analysis. It provides a valuable geospatial perspective on electrification strategy. It also provides agencies such as the REA, the REA, there's the Renewable Energy Rural Electrification Agency, Nigeria, that we are seeking to deploy projects that are designed based on evidence-based and specially optimized interventions. So I'd like to commend the researchers. But back to your question on the alignment with the mandate of the agency, you may recall that there's a new Electricity Act in 2023. That act has clearly mandated the agency to look around unserved and underserved communities. Unserved communities is just a synonym for rural communities, while underserved communities are usually communities based. You might be, I'm sure everyone is familiar with the Nigerian electricity sector, the kind of supply around the on-grid sector, the unreliability of the grid. So most of these areas, with the exception of Band A, will fall under the underserved communities. Furthermore, you may recall that in the past, the agency has the Rural Electrification Strategy Implementation Plan, which was the guiding policy around the deployment of electrification in the country. However, with time, with the involvement of new technologies and new ideas, we've now revised it to be the National Electrification Strategy Implementation Plan. And the technologies that we're looking at the NESIP end, we are looking at interconnected mini grids. We're also looking at the mesh grids and many more technologies. Also, you may recall sometime back in the country in the early days with the support of GIZ, we able to roll out what I call the first generation of interconnected mini grids, which was deployed, and a lot of lessons were extracted from those set of mini grids. It took a decade to have most of the mini grids completed, but finally they've seen the light. So with respect to opportunities, absolutely, the opportunities are there. If you follow the REA activities, you would see that REA is continuously aligning with stakeholders such as the TCN, the DISCOs, to even institutionalize, and subnationals to institutionalize the geospatial database, and to see how we can optimize site selection and avoid stranded assets. To speaking in furtherance,
I'm going to ask you to wrap up, please. Yeah, apologies, but if you can wrap it up.
Oh, okay. So I'll stop here. I'll take it up.
Thank you so much. Brian, I'd like to invite you from the Anzana Group. As a private, distribution utility, how are you approaching, building out the grid in markets such as Burundi, Zambia, Malawi, and other markets that you are, looking at? And how does grid-tied DREs fit into, your grid build-out plans?
Well, thanks for the question, and thanks for having me. Also, thanks to Jess and Sam. This is quite topical and useful research. So for us, I mean, I think just it highlights the kind of choice that you're often put into categories, and that category in this space has not always been accurate. And I think we're kind of as a company, as Anzana, we're kind of busting that sort of binary choice open a little bit. But if you're choosing between rural and urban, or you're choosing between grid and off-grid, or public and private, or large and centralized and small and decentralized, the fact of the matter is that it's sort of expected that the private sector is going to do the off-grid, private, small and decentralized projects, but those make the least economic sense. And it doesn't have to be that those need to be separate from the public side. And I think what we're doing at Anzana is we are blending those categories in the same way that urban and rural are blended in the research. So if you think about where one of the reasons probably that mini grids that you found were in this IRCA 30 category is because everyone was afraid that the grid might get there someday, so they're building as far away as possible. The grid can be your friend. I think that's where we're starting to see shifts, and we are trying to create them. For us, it's public-private partnerships or joint ventures with national utilities to expand the grid, because I think in some countries you have a lack of generation, and that's problematic, and you need to build some generation. In other countries, the generation needs to be distributed to new customers, but the government doesn't have or their government utility doesn't have the ability to expand the grid themselves. It doesn't have the kind of wherewithal to take on additional capital and efficiently bring the power lines to communities. And looking at this research, one of the countries where we're operating, and we are primarily focused on rural communities, is Burundi. According to this study, I mean, basically nobody in Burundi is rural, which on the one hand is not totally true, but on the other hand speaks to the point that, people are rural, but it speaks to the point that they're very densely populated, they're very close to urban centers, and the solution from an electrification perspective is going to be that everyone should be connected to the grid, pretty much. And that's sort of surprising for a country that has 12% grid access. To have the grid be the solution for everyone points at a different problem, not a geographic problem, not a demographic problem. Points to more of a political and capacity issue, historically, a financial capacity. So what we're trying to do at Anzana is blend public and private capital, public and private grids, and to the extent that it's needed, that distributed generation can support that grid. Even a national grid would tell you that it's great to have distributed generation on your network. It helps supply a more reliable load. But if you're only using distributed small scale systems, then you're stuck with the relatively higher cost of the smaller economy of scales of those power plants. So blending the fact that you can have access to large centralized, let's say, hydropower at 7 cents a kilowatt hour with distributed systems that help create local load, then you're in a much better situation.
Thank you so much. And on that point, I'd like to invite, Vishal from class. And I think for me, this hopefully I can come back to you, Brian, but I want class just to come in and share with us in terms of what is class position in terms of integrating demand side infrastructure into the grid expansion budgets, and how does this analysis, relate to the recent call to action that class has put out?
Thank you, Sumaya. Thank you very much for the question. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, depending on which part of the world you are. Sam and Jess, thank you for the presentation. Fantastic, fantastic research. And I think it plugs a very important gap and helps move the thinking forward and how we might be able to address this. I think for a long time, we've been consumed and perhaps overwhelmed by the scale of energy poverty, the millions that we've seen that don't have access, and of course, even billions more that don't have access to clean cooking. But what recently has really consumed us over the last few years is what I would call the growing energy inequality. And by that, I mean, if we look at the pace of changes in the energy sector, digitization, and all the other trends, we don't see that same pace of accelerated pace of progress in the reduction in energy access, right? The lack of energy access. And so we're essentially seeing this growing divide, and we're asking the question, well, why is that? Why is energy access or the lack of energy access so persistent? And we might think, oh, because there's not enough energy. But if we look at the growth in how much energy generation is taking place, we know that even a small fraction can solve that. We might think, oh, it's so much resources are needed. But if we look at the investments taking place, even, for example, within the energy sector in Africa, we see even a small fraction could be. And I think one of the views that is probably that you've dismantled in this research is this idea that, look, it is this rural-urban divide, and it's so hard to get to areas without access. And all of a sudden, the research is showing us very starkly that that may not be the case. And so the question is, why? And what we've concluded in a recent research that we've provided called the missing piece of energy access is that in order for access to meaningfully expand, it has to be viable, right? It has to be profitable for somebody to supply and somebody to demand it. And I think that's essentially catch-all for many reasons, for many factors it may be, but we're looking at that and then trying to ask, we're not seeing demand be stimulated fast enough in order to induce energy supply to take place. How can we create sustainable demand? And then that brings us down to two sort of broad factors. One is, look, people need appliances and equipment in order to create demand. You need your lights, television, fans, equipment, small motors, etc. And that one, while those products may be available, it doesn't trickle down to those markets. So just because the products are there, it doesn't mean that it's going to be available, even in the areas that you described. Nobody's going to, very few people will drive 2-3 hours or 1-2 hours, go buy it and then bring it back someplace. Like, you need those markets and the services around those products to be available there. And I think that's the first thing we're calling for, is this idea that markets have to be where people are located. And then the second thing that we're calling for as part of this demand growth is to look at how public finance can be used to kickstart that initial catalytic effect that you need to induce these markets to come in, product markets to come in. And we believe that by supplementing energy demand, or by ensuring that the growth, the investments that is being assigned to growth in energy access through the supply infrastructure, if even 15% of that could be applied to demand stimulation by creating markets there, by using some public finances to be able to spur those markets and kickstart the markets, we believe will provide a sustainable level of demand that would then make it viable, economically viable, for these grids to come in and essentially serve. And the grids, as several has been already mentioned, is not just the centralized grid, but it's a centralized grid in combination perhaps with several other types of grid that is now making the totality of what energy supply means. And we're very excited by this research, Jess and Sam, that really shows us that it's not the distance that's now. I think we're helping to answer the question why. And I think why is we got to think about it in terms of planning both energy and supply demand together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know time is very limited, but I do want to just make some time for at least 1 to 2 questions. I see that there's been a few questions that has come up, and Sam, I'd actually like you to respond to the question, because I think that was a really good question that was asked about the finance I see that you've just responded to, I think it was Ambrose. So Ambrose asked the question in terms of, with these excellent findings, what would be your guidance on the low-hanging fruit in terms of investment by size, design, and business models to reach, the highest numbers? And can you also comment on, the financial access as a barrier in the urban setting?
Thank you. No, some great questions, and I'm definitely I love it when there's active chats. It shows that a lot of engagement, and the panelists are providing this great walkthrough of all these issues. It seems like we've really kind of touched on a live wire here, pardon the pun. So I think in terms of operationalizing the findings, I think one critical thing is taking a more nuanced country by country approach that not only accounts for the demographics across these different geographies, but bakes in the different specificities around regulatory arrangements. And that would be a sort of operational component that can start to speak to the realities of things like cost of capital. There's been a lot of good studies recently that demonstrate that a lot of models at the continent level are just assuming the same cost of capital across geographies when that's not at all the same, and that's not kind of realistic. A second thing would be to incorporate a more dynamic view. What we've done is shown a snapshot, but what we can actually do is project where the demographics of energy poverty will be concentrated, not now, not retrospectively, but in 5, 10, 20, 30 years. This is these urbanization phenomena are things that are going to be playing out over multi-decadal processes. So we really need to be more proactive in thinking about that. Then lastly, and most importantly, this is going to be a plug for more research, is working with folks on this call to bake in the qualitative insights around finance, around how to bake in the specificities of health imperatives, looking specifically at health centers, for example, in rural and peri-urban or remote and peri-urban spaces, to bake in these really important qualitative indicators into a quantitative framework that challenges the established narrative about where technologies should go. So please ask a more directed question to me if I skirted the actual answer you were looking for, but I really think I'm using this question to motivate a conversation with both the panelists that are on this call and many of the folks that are asking questions so that we can actually put forth a more rigorous analysis that tackles these different specificities on the finance side, on the regulatory side, and the technological side.
That was perfect, and we are unfortunately, reaching the very bitter end, of this discussion. But it's just as Sam said. For me, I see this, only as the beginning. There's more work that needs to be done. I want to also just thank, our esteemed panelists. But please, do keep those questions coming in, and we'll try our best, to give some responses with the materials that will be shared. So in closing, contrary to the dominant narrative, Africa's energy access challenge is not confined to remote villages. In fact, as the presenters shared the research, they indicated that 63% of the continent's unelectrified populations live in and around or near cities. Only 8% are in truly remote rural areas. With this, tells us that in many so-called rural areas are in reality rapidly urbanizing, and the energy needs are functionally urban. This shift carries profound implications. For policy, it means aligning institutional mandates with the realities of urbanization rather than outdated rural-urban divides. For grid expansion, it means moving beyond high-cost, low-demand grid extensions and instead enabling collaboration between utilities and decentralized renewable energy providers to build out efficient, scalable models. On the demand side, we must remember that supply alone is not enough. Access to appliances, productive use, and demand creation must be built into grid planning from the onset. For investment, we must break down the silos, channeling blended capital and results-based financing into integrated energy solutions that delivers real impact. Finally, as we look towards Mission 300, we must rethink this 50-50 split between on-grid and off-grid. Urban decentralized solutions are accelerators to the grid. By driving demand and complementing the grid expansion, that can help us move faster towards universal access. So let us leave here with clarity. The future of energy access in Africa is not only rural, and it is certainly not binary. It is urbanizing, integrated, and demand-driven. If we embrace this reality, we can unlock the scale, the speed, and the systems change needed to achieve universal access. And with that, I thank you all most welcome for, joining us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.